Okay, so welcome to our today's webinar organized by SoftServe and product management community, which is an important part of it. And before we'll start, I'll give you just a short intro. So SoftServe is a software development company specializing in consulting services in the field of big data, IoT, cloud, e-commerce, security, and experience design. And we have our offices here in Poland and also globally in Poland. We are based in Wrocław, Gliwice, Białystok, Warsaw, Gdańsk, Kraków, and Łódź. And now let me introduce you to our speakers. Kamil Góra, who is a product manager at SoftServe, and Rob Stephenson, a group product manager at Spotify. And today, Rob will introduce you to the topic of metrics and their purpose. So enjoy the meeting. And guys, I'm passing the voice to you.
Thank you, Kasia, for the introduction. So, yeah, I'm really happy to welcome everyone here. I'm really glad that I have an opportunity to host today's meeting. As Kasia mentioned, with SoftServe and product management community, we're glad to welcome you on the meeting. And today, we'll talk about the metrics. And metrics are a daily tool probably for all of us, because it's probably one of the easiest way to evaluate or analyze our performance of our team, customer satisfaction, return of product investment, and much more, right? But like any tool, metrics can be used effectively and wisely, but also completely wrong, which can result in unnecessary losses, wrong decision on product development path, and a lot of dissatisfaction. So how to avoid that wrong situation? So today, I think Rob, our special guest, will tell us what type of group of metrics are useful in product work and product development, and how to use them correctly. But before we'll jump to that clue and Robert's speech, let's agree a few rules, okay? So first of all, I would like to ask to avoid some disturbances for Rob's speech. So if you have some questions which you want directly ask Rob, please place it on the chat. So I will keep all of them. And during some end of the chapters of our presentation, we'll back to that proper questions, and with Rob, we'll try to answer on it. Or if you will prefer to ask them directly to Rob, you can just wait for the end of our presentation. We'll have the short slot for the Q&A, so he will have the opportunity for the live discussion. If everything is okay for you, Rob, I'm passing voice to you. Stage is yours.
Yes, hello, and thank you. Let me just, let's see, configure Zoom so I can share this screen. Okay, good. You're looking at the title slide now?
Yes, we
Perfect.
Can see your slides.
Very nice. Okay, yes, thanks you for the introduction, Kasia and Kamil. My name is Rob Stephenson, and I am a group product manager at Spotify. I'm originally from Toronto, Canada. I studied computer science at the University of Waterloo, where I did some research in distributed systems and minored in graph theory. So a nice mix of very pragmatic and intense backend infrastructure stuff, as well as the very theoretical and sort of not pragmatic mathematical things. And then after graduation, I moved to California, where I was working for LinkedIn for a couple of years. And actually, the team that I joined at LinkedIn was the graph database team, which was this sort of beautiful overlap between the research I was doing and the theory that I was so painfully interested in. And the tech didn't disappoint either. It was a very cool project to be working on. It also had the benefit of, it was really easy for me to understand why this tech mattered to the business. So I've got on the screen here a few examples of different screenshots from LinkedIn, and I'll point out where some areas where the graph database was used. And just little bit of a background, a graph database is like a regular database, but it specializes in storing connections between things. So because LinkedIn is a social network to some extent, or professional social network, you have connections between myself and other people. People follow me, I follow others. I also have an employment history, which would be an edge in this graph database. And then we use this network in order to serve some kind of interesting use cases in the website. So for example, Kevin Scott, who was the CTO when I was at LinkedIn, I can go to his page and it shows that I have 21 mutual connections with him. Maybe I could ask Jorge for an introduction so we can grab a cup of coffee. Probably Kevin doesn't have time for me, but in theory, maybe. Or I could go and click on the Databricks company and it says that I could ask Gleb for a referral. So this is what the graph database was serving, and being able to make use of the network is really one of the things that helped LinkedIn grow. At the time that I joined, and this was back in 2013, there was also a pretty understandable strategy. And company-wide, we had this project we called Project 400. And the belief was that if we could get latency on every page to be under 400 milliseconds, then that was good enough. But above 400 milliseconds would cause churn because it was too slow. So we were trying to serve these, interesting, this interesting information out of the graph database, but we needed to make sure that it was fast enough so we could be less than 400 milliseconds, or that the upstream page would be less than 400 milliseconds. And that meant that what we ended up doing is we would get hyper specialized for serving a few use cases that we knew were important. And the use cases which were less important or didn't exactly exist, like maybe generic queries, it was okay if they were slow. So this was pretty cool, working on cool tech, understanding the business purpose, understanding the strategy. But then halfway through my time at LinkedIn, we decided that we would rewrite the database completely, because company-wide they had ambitions to be able to map the whole economy into LinkedIn and into this database. And they started talking about the general economic graph. And that meant we needed to be able to store much more generic and complicated relationships and make it possible to query via a language as opposed to just via an API, which would satisfy a few important business use cases. So think like querying Postgres with SQL, something like that. So while this was extremely cool, and they did publish some papers on it long after I left, the business value was a little bit difficult to understand. Conceptually, it sounded like you could do so much with this, but yeah, it was a little bit hard to grasp how this was going to matter to the company. And unfortunately, I left too early to hear the answer to that, because in 2016, I moved to Sweden and joined Spotify. And I was still working in the overlap between distributed systems and data. I joined the event delivery team. And event delivery is really the source of all data that we have at Spotify. So if you think about how you listen to some music, or you make searches, or you navigate through the app, we'll log events from this data, and then we use it to satisfy some kind of need. So the obvious case is that when you listen to something, we have to pay royalties on that. But we also, will check how you react to some recommendation, if that caused you to stream something, and then we can determine, yes, that was a good recommendation, etc. And many more use cases for data as well. And when I joined, we had this product manager named Johan. And I was always quite inspired by the way that Johan would work, because he would look throughout the company and think about different ways that we were struggling to use data, or we could use it for much more impactful stuff, and find possibilities that my team and the tech we were building could be leveraged in order to achieve that kind of like higher level business goal. So he was searching for this overlap between building cool tech and satisfying something important to the business. And I thought that was pretty cool. And eventually Johan, he did this, and then he got pulled away to lead one of the projects that he ended up starting. And now he's the head of experimentation at Spotify. But that left our team without a product manager. And I realized that we're still shipping, we're still delivering important stuff, but nobody was looking to see if people were using the event delivery system any differently, and if we were having the kind of business impact that we were supposed to be. So I started doing this, and I was doing a reasonably good job, I guess, because they suggested I apply to be the product manager full time, and that's how my journey in product started. So basically, I can say that my foundation for product management came from three places. Firstly, from my sort of domain expertise in data and distributed systems engineering. And then secondly, from watching and trying to copy Johan and learning everything I could from him. And then thirdly, from reading these three books and some others, but these were the three that I think were most impactful on me. 5 years of experience later, I've learned a lot and formed some pretty strong opinions on things which work and what don't work. Of course, I have a pretty specific vantage point coming from working in a couple of big companies like Spotify and LinkedIn, as well as working in the platform organization. But I believe that a lot of these opinions are generalizable to other things too. So you're going to hear about one of my opinions today. That is how to use metrics in a way which is actually useful. And of course, you think, of course, yes, metrics are useful. We get lots of value out of them. And I'm not really challenging that the value in metrics, but I found that I don't really agree with how the literature tends to talk about metrics. I don't buy into using it to talk about how your product is doing or how your team is performing. I think instead that metrics are really, the main purpose is to learn about something. And as a result, if we think about metrics only as the way to evaluate how a product is doing, yeah, that makes sense if you're working in more of like an entrepreneurship-like environment, like the lean startup describes. But when you get to a bigger company, or your product might be something which is internal and there's many layers built on top of it, then you're fitting into a much bigger context and much broader strategies. And you need to try, and the metrics are instead, not necessarily about how your product is performing, but how you're able to fit into and contribute to these strategies. So if you buy my premise that metrics are about learning and not so much about evaluating product performance, then it raises the question, what do you need to learn? And that depends on the strategy. So today I'm going to dive a little bit more into that third book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. But this is not going to be a lecture on that book. I'm more going to think about how metrics can be used to support and clarify your strategy, as opposed to going into too many details. But I highly recommend reading it if you haven't before. Yes, so metrics are about learning, and strategy will describe what's important to learn right now. But without going into too many details, I'll just touch a little bit on what strategy is and what it isn't, according to Richard Rumelt in this book. And first, it must contain a diagnosis, which would be a deep understanding of where we are right now. And that would be the context that our product and our team and our tech lives in. So the business context, the strategies that the company is currently working on, maybe the org, things like this, the competitive landscape. And then secondly, it will have a set of guiding principles. And these are the beliefs that we hold, maybe the vision that we aspire towards, trade-offs or business constraints that we shouldn't sacrifice in order to deliver on this strategy. And this really represents how we're going to approach the problem and how we're not going to approach the problem, as opposed to what we're going to do to solve it. And then thirdly, it will contain a very opinionated set of coherent actions, which will describe the plan. And from all of these things together, it should be clear what we plan on doing, how we're going to do it and how we're not going to do it, and why we're going to do it from the diagnosis. So now to think about how metrics can support us with strategy. Let's start with the coherent action section. And in our strategy, we, through the understanding we have from the diagnosis, we form a hypothesis that we want to make a bet on. And the coherent actions describe what we want to deliver in order to try to achieve the bet, in order for us to actually make the bet. Because there's a difference between shipping code and building new features and actually having some kind of outcome that we think is going to be meaningful, metrics can help us sort of describe this. And note that I'm using the word bet here on purpose because what we're talking about is probably assumptions. It's that because we understand this, we believe that doing this will have that impact, and the metrics will help us check these assumptions. So to try to anchor this with an example, I'll go back to my time at LinkedIn. So try to put yourself in the mindset of 10 years ago LinkedIn. And I'll start with the diagnosis. So at the time, LinkedIn is not as engaging as Facebook. It's not as well used as Facebook. Comparatively, they have a pretty poor DAU to MAU ratio. So you're coming to LinkedIn, you're spending very short intentional sessions, and then maybe you don't come back for the rest of the month. And people were growing their network and engaging with LinkedIn, but they're primarily adding only coworkers or former coworkers. And while this is interesting, the real value that people were getting out of LinkedIn was using it to look for jobs. So the value you would get out of LinkedIn was for adding connections with new prospective employers or people who you've never worked with before. And with our understanding of the professional network and the social graph, we could surface these connections that we think would be more valuable to people than just their direct coworkers. And firstly, I should say, this is a diagnosis of understanding. I'm making this up, but it fits in order to be able to sort of paint the picture of the example that I want. This is not necessarily how it was 10 years ago, but I'll get back into it. Okay, so with that as a sort of premise for something we might be able to do, we want to increase the value that people get by increasing the valuable connections we surface. We also recognize that if they don't get enough connections at the start, then they might churn because having a social network with no connections doesn't give you any value. So we need to be able to help them get to a critical mass quickly. And then once they're at a critical mass, that's when it's time to try to provide them with these value add connections. Overall, the hypothesis is that we should be able to increase the value LinkedIn provides to people and increase the user base through this strategy. In theory, this will then make people come back to LinkedIn more often because it's more valuable, and that will increase the ratio of DAU to MAU and reduce churn. So hopefully you followed that so far. I'm going to reiterate it, but instead phrased in the form of bets and assumptions. So the first bet is generally that we believe we can increase the ratio of daily active users to monthly active users and reduce churn if we can make sessions more valuable. We have an assumption that the churning rate is way higher if you don't have 100 connections yet, but above 100 connections, you sort of have that critical mass to stay. We also assume that connecting with a non-colleague that you might know through a friend of a friend is more valuable than surfacing other types of connections. And there's another assumption in here from my old strategy, Project 400, that if the site is slower than 400 milliseconds, people will churn regardless, but faster than 400 milliseconds, there's diminishing returns. It doesn't matter too much to get faster than that. So with that, we can then craft some metrics which will help us make clear what the assumptions are and the strategic goals that we have, and then we might have a metric as well which helps us and through crafting these strategic metrics and understanding the business metric we're supposed to move, we can check that if we achieve those, we indeed do have correlation on the high-level business metric. So in summary, metrics can be a big help to be able to make clear your strategy and specify the strategic outcomes you're trying to have in those coherent actions. They should describe the goal we're trying to achieve. And remember that delivering and shipping stuff doesn't necessarily mean you've achieved that goal, because we may have shipped something which we thought was going to lead to people getting these more valuable connections, but then if they didn't do it, we didn't have the outcome we were looking for. And then lastly, you can use these metrics to check for correlation between the outcomes you've been trying to have and the eventual business outcome. And with that, I'm going to take a moment to pause and see if there's any questions about strategic metrics, or at least my take on this.
Thanks, Rob. We do not have any question on our chat, so it's just a small reminder to our viewers. If you have any additional questions, feel free to type them in the chat or ask them directly after our session, because we'll have a Q&A after the presentation. So, yeah, let's keep going. Rob, thanks.
Sure. Okay. All right. So that was strategic metrics. Now let's look at another type of metrics, guardrail metrics. And these are different because improving them is not the purpose of strategy. These instead represent constraints and trade-offs that we either don't want to sacrifice or want to make sure we're careful with. So you can think about modeling this as like a mathematical optimization function, where the strategic metric is the variable we're trying to optimize and increase, and the guardrail metrics represent constraints or thresholds that we want to make sure we stay below. And these can be, and you can set guardrail metrics in two different ways. One is the sort of constraints or consequences that you are expecting and want to make sure that you protect against. So this might be, an example would be if you're doing something new and fancy with machine learning, and machine learning is typically quite expensive. So you might have a budget for how much cloud cost you're willing to spend on that, and have a constraint which would make sure that you stay kind of below that budget. But another example might be a trade-off into a different aspect of the business that you want to be careful with. Like, let's say you're trying to monetize the way that you serve ads in a freemium-based model, and everybody hates ads. So you have to be quite careful with this, that you don't make the experience worse to the point that people don't want to use it anymore and churn. So you monetize ads, but not at the expense of the user experience in some measurable way. And those would be what I'll call intentional guardrails. But then the unintentional, or sort of the unexpected ones, are really important aspects of the business that you don't expect to have consequences on, but you damn well want to be careful that you don't. And I can use an example from Spotify here, where across all the A/B testing and experimentation we do, we'll have a guardrail on a metric which is about how much music people are listening to. And there's tons of different things we could roll out and we can experiment on that probably have nothing to do with listening to music. But if for some reason they ended up negatively impacting people listening to music, that was a bad change. So as a result, by making sure that we kind of codify different aspects of the business we know can't be sacrificed as a result of what we're doing, we can set guardrail metrics to protect us in that way. So I mentioned a couple of examples already. Another example that I like to think about is with Twitter right now. So if you, one thing I've been thinking about with Twitter is that I personally get value, and a lot of people get value out of Twitter, because you can go there for short form live sort of news updates from people who are influential in particular segments that you might be interested in. So there's these verified profiles that are, journalists or professional athletes, or I don't know, gamers or something, which is a little bit more niche. And the algorithm promotes these people because they're verified and influential. But as Twitter makes the change to try to monetize this verification process, they sell access to that level of influence, basically. And if they do, and what the change that they made most recently, where they then, if you didn't spend $8 a month as your sort of like influencer fee, if you didn't buy that, then you lost your level of influence, and it made the quality of content very poor. As a result, all of a sudden, the quality of content that you're seeing on Twitter is much worse, because it's no longer verified influential people. It's anyone who paid $8 a month, regardless of their sort of importance within the niche you're interested in. And then personally, I stopped using it. They're adapting, so maybe they do have a guardrail metric to protect against this level of churn with this sort of monetization strategy. But this is somewhere where you might want to check that you're not cannibalizing another important part of your business with your strategy. And then, cloud cost is another guardrail metric that I think is really interesting, because if you're spending too much money on the cloud, then it can be a strategic metric to try to decrease it. But if you were to take this all the way, you could just shut down all your tech, and then you have no cost, but you have no product either then. So there's a certain threshold where the cost is actually okay. And the guardrail metric should help you, detect if you are still spending an okay amount of money on cloud, but you shouldn't be considering it a strategic metric when you're below that, because all of a sudden, you need to go do other things. There's higher opportunity cost than saving more money. So to map this back to good strategy, bad strategy, we can use guardrail metrics to make clear some of the guiding principles that we have. And I've talked already about how you can use guardrail metrics to protect yourself from different business constraints, or from cannibalizing other important aspects of strategy, or other important strategies or impact that the business has. But you can also use them to keep yourself in line towards the vision. And there's a quote that I really liked from the Lean Startup book, which I'm going to say. And it's a little bit, graphic maybe, but that helps remember it. And the idea is that if you only focus for click-through rate on the content on posts, then we'll become a porn company in no time. And this, once again, while a little bit graphic, it's well known in the advertising industry that sex sells, and sexualized content will be engaged with. However, if that's not what the product you're trying to build, and you're only looking at that metric, then you might end up following that metric down the wrong path. So to give an example of where you might protect yourself against something like that, let's say you're, I don't know, a fashion company, and you're trying to make sure that you're showing a particular type of sports fashion, and you're showing it on athletes. I don't know. You might have some way that you can validate that the type of content that you have loaded is sticking with your vision, as opposed to maybe something which is not intended. The bottom line is that with guardrail metrics, you want to be explicit with various aspects of the business and the strategic context that you're going to make sure stay in good shape. But the point is not to be optimizing for those metrics. They're just rails for safety. If you're within the rails, you're okay. And I'm going to take another pause here for some questions on guardrail metrics, if there's any.
No, we do not have any questions yet on the chat, so maybe we'll have something on the live discussion at the end. So I think we can keep going.
Okay. All right. So my initial frustration with metrics comes from the fact that a lot of the teams that I've worked on throughout my career would put together these metrics scorecards. And we'd display the metrics that we have, and we'd report them to our leadership structures quarterly, and we'd explain away the metrics that look bad and take credit for the ones that look good. We'd learn nothing and keep doing the same stuff. And this is where I sort of grew frustrated with the literature, because it's not like the literature is wrong. They're describing the metrics from a business perspective, and it really does make sense for the sort of like entrepreneurial stuff that strategies that you're trying to execute on. But in a big company like Spotify or LinkedIn, or maybe much smaller than that, like bigger than a couple hundred people, these companies will have higher level strategies, and those strategies will be subdivided across maybe many different teams. And my claim is that without being able to tie these scorecards to strategies, then they become a waste of time at best. At worst, they end up sending you in the wrong direction, because you might draw some conclusion that's not true anymore because you forgot what the metric represented and the context that it lived in. And new strategy, it's clear how I discussed earlier how you can use metrics to help you to support your new strategy, but old strategy is okay too, as long as you remember the context that it lived in. Then when you see something change, you can remember that and then use it as a learning opportunity for something which has changed from when you set that. So back to my graph database team, let's take a look at the scorecard that I set up here. Well, we see the latency zone. And now if we remember that, this was a guardrail metric and there was a magic threshold of 400 milliseconds, and we're still well below that, maybe this is okay. If it's been trending up for some time, we should probably look at it. But if it's, fluctuating significantly, then maybe that's not something we need to worry about, because we're still below that threshold. And then there's this value add connection metric that we have, which is way up. Maybe that's very surprising, because we haven't been working on that in a while. So what does that mean? Is it good? Who knows? And now that we understand and remember what that was representing, we can go learn. And it turns out this did happen, and it was because the way that connections were happening on LinkedIn started to change. They started trying to create these influencers so people would be able to read, posts from interesting people within say the tech domain or something. And as a result, you ended up having some connections which had millions of other connections. So the concept of a friend then needed to take that into consideration. There was at least when I was there, the sort of most highly connected person was Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin Media, or the founder of Virgin Media. And all of a sudden, it might look like I have 7 million more connections because he had 7 million, or 7 million more prospective connections because he had 7 million connections himself. But it's not the case, because I can't just go ask Richard Branson to introduce me to any of his friends, any of his 7 million friends. So things changed. And as a result of remembering the old strategy that this metric lived in, I was able to go learn that. Let's think a little bit about how a company invests in a strategy. So you decide that there's some kind of, like, you have your diagnosis and you decide that there's some action you want to bet on, which we think is going to be meaningful to the business. And you hire some people to do that. Maybe you shift people from one part of the org to another. And then you subdivide parts of the strategy into different teams. And then And maybe this is a cascade of teams because it's many, and then eventually you execute. Let's say the strategy was a grand success and now it's done, but the org remains and the old assumptions that were built into this strategy remains. And that means that there's probably old metrics representing old assumptions that are floating around in scorecards somewhere. But remember, these, if you don't remember the strategy or the context behind these old assumptions, these old metrics, then they might be useless. But if you do, then they can help you understand what has changed since you were last thinking about that strategy. So that's for old assumptions. What about understanding how you fit into the org right now? Imagine that you were to join my team in the data platform tribe. Well, our users are not people listening to music. Our users are data engineers and insights people at Spotify. So we're trying to make those users happier and make them get more value out of our product. But that's a means to an end. They're trying to solve some business purpose themselves, these users. So I found it a very good exercise to trace the different initiatives that we're working on in my team upstream to actual business value. And this was a really useful exercise to provide clarity to understand the different company strategies that I was contributing to, and then see opportunity for where we could do better or where we could be more focused. But more often than not, I find this exercise actually leads to realizing that as we trace the cascading assumptions all the way up in the company, especially a big company like Spotify, we might realize that the pieces don't fit very well, and that there's some broken telephone between this cascade of assumptions, which is maybe causing us and maybe others to work on the wrong stuff. To illustrate this with an example, I'll once again stick with my own team. So the data platform tribe at Spotify, we're trying to improve the productivity of data engineers and insights people. I'll follow the chain at the top here. And if we think, okay, what is the main goal of these data engineers are trying to solve for right now? Well, they're trying to help us do better machine learning. Okay, well, what business purposes does the machine learning solve for us? Well, it helps us do better music recommendations. All right, what does better music recommendations do? Well, if people tend to turn to our personalization as their main mechanism for discovering the music that they're going to listen to in their session, then that gives us a way to distribute music, or rather a way to influence what people are listening to that our competitors can't easily copy. So it's a competitive advantage. As a result of that, they are less likely to churn from Spotify to Apple Music, maybe, if we can do a very good job with the personalization. And by tracing this cascade and being able to connect what we're doing to this higher level company strategy, now I can understand really which aspects we should be focusing on, which users we should be focusing on, what tasks those users are doing that we should try to make sure are extra easy. So back to good strategy, bad strategy. I believe that these existing assumptions and the sort of cascade of them that lives in big companies represents a major part of the diagnosis and understanding the current situation that you're in. And like I said, more often than not, that exercise helps me understand where pieces don't really fit and where the assumptions might be wrong. And this can be really useful. But overall, I find this kind of recognizing that it's a cascade and being able to trace my way through the cascade a very way to understand what's going on and then to figure out what bets I should be trying to make. So if you've taken away nothing from this talk, I hope you remember one thing. Metrics, if you're not careful, can be useless, but you can use them to learn a lot. And the main purpose is that metrics are about learning. Then if you accept that the metrics are about learning, what is it that you need to learn? And this is where you need to be able to tie them to strategy. So I think you can tie metrics to all the three parts of the strategy that they talk about in this book. Firstly, the coherent actions you can reflect those in metrics with strategic goals. Then the guiding principles, you can reflect those in metrics with guardrails. And then your diagnosis, you can understand the cascade of assumptions that you live in and the old strategies that you or your org has been a part of can be reflected in these metric scorecards. And as long as you remember the context they live in, it can be useful. I have some other opinions that I'll quickly run through on this. I mentioned that metrics are for learning, but there's other ways to learn too. So it's possible that if there's not a lot of ambiguity, maybe metrics are overkill. Maybe you want to do a technical spike to try to understand if the tech can support you to get there or not. Maybe you want to, go spend more time talking to users and do some user research. And all of these different ways are flawed, and they can all be different. They can all be very useful. Metrics are just one tool that you can use for learning. Something which I found to be a really nice way to get value out of metrics is to use them to just describe the goals that you're trying to do, even if measuring them is very, very hard or impossible. So if I can say that, we're trying to get users to change this behavior and move this metric in this direction, and that can be an important alignment tool for several teams to work towards the same goal. Measuring it becomes a secondary problem. And maybe I'll try to measure, maybe not, if it's generally accepted. Of course, there's danger with that too. And then lastly, if you're working in a platform team and your users are, let's say, in the hundreds as opposed to in the millions, because your users are data engineers or something, then beware of statistically insignificant metrics or metrics that end up having a huge error bound. And that doesn't mean that the signals the metrics will provide are going to be useless, but they might be misleading. So take it just as one input that you can start investigating and not as a source of truth. And that's all. I hope this was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for that very valuable presentation. First question to our audience. Does anyone have some question to ask directly to Rob about that, what he said? Okay, if not, I have one at least for now. So you said that with your team, you're trying to understand the situation and learn from the metrics, right? And I would like to ask you more deeply about the learning process, how it looks like with your team, how you're organizing that learning process. If you have some meetings where you are analyzing it, or it's just the internal direction day by day, how it's going on that process.
Yeah, let me, I guess it kind of depends. Like there's some metrics which are really easy to make true, like cost, for example, there's a bill. And then there's other metrics which, like I say, have a really big error bound. So when we're talking about these sort of metrics, which are definitely easy to be true, then you can put them in a report and kind of describe them and share them in Slack and stuff like this. We don't tend to have a meeting where we actually actively discuss the metrics. If the metrics are, let's say, have a lot, we'll tend to have a lot more noise in them, then we'll take it and make hypotheses based on these, and then we'll go investigate further in some way, maybe with user research, and validate whether or not the conclusions the metrics we're pointing us towards were actually true or not. So an example is we have this system for orchestrating data pipelines, and we've been trying to increase the adoption of that and deprecate the old thing. And we see that it's trending upwards, but it's like that the usage of it is trending upwards, but it's like trending from 30 users to 50. That, that's probably meaningful, but maybe because of Hack Week or something, there was a sharp spike in trying this new thing. So there's a lot of error in a increase from 30 to 20, or sorry, from 30 to 50. So when we see this, we say, okay, it looks pretty good, but let's go learn more. And then we do some other way of learning to sort of make a hypothesis and then prove whether or not it's true.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks, Rob. Okay, we have also the first question for our guests. Victor typed, what tools would you recommend for tracking metrics?
Yeah, so once again, I'll clarify again, because it's about learning, it might be useful to just look at the metric and trends, but generally I want to see it and say, oh, that's interesting, let me go learn more. So a tool which will allow me to maybe slice and dice it and then dive deeper into it and try to understand it better is more what I'm looking for. We tend to use, Looker and Tableau are both pretty good for this. In Tableau, I believe both of them allow you to have a view where you can visualize the metric and trend, as well as dive deeper into the data. Also, notebooks are just really useful. You can take some data set which supported a visualization, update it on a regular basis, You want to dive deeper in it, you can write SQL queries and slice and dice it in different ways. So I would say like the main tools for people who are not familiar, who are maybe not tech savvy enough to use notebooks would be Looker and Tableau, and then notebooks are really good too.
Yeah, that's a point, and I think again for that type of question, the proper answer, it depends. Because it depends from the environment of the tools which people are using, what is the specific particular situation and environment for the product which we are doing, etc. So right now on the market, we can find a lot of very specified tools for this each specific type of product. So yeah, but in general, Tableau, Looker, Google Analytics are one of the most common on the market. Okay, does anyone have any additional question right now? Okay, we have another one from Victor. What do you think of the North Star metric concept?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because this is something that's gotten a lot of traction from what I've been seeing in the industry lately. And I personally don't find it to be very valuable. But once again, keep in mind that the point of view that I come from is from a platform team where I have hundreds of users instead of millions. And in a big company where I'm contributing to one piece of a much bigger strategy. I think that I won't give an example because I don't think I can reveal too much, but like there's higher level Spotify strategies where there's for like a department which holds hundreds of people, where a North Star metric can be really, really useful. I think when you subdivide it and then get down to individual teams, I think that it can be more noise than value. And once again, this is just my opinion from the perspective that I'm in. I think it definitely applies when you're able to make sure it links to business value. I think it's just quite hard to do that in smaller, sort of more subdivided contexts, like in a big company.
Victor, is it proper answer for you? Need something else here, or do you need some? Okay, thank you. Thank you also, Victor, for that very nice questions. Does anyone have something else to add, to discuss? If not, first of all, I would like to thank Europe for that awesome presentation. I think it was really useful, and everyone from our audience could see some insights from your daily basis work and from your concept of cooperation with the metrics. Thank you for our audience, for our guests to be with us today. And hopefully we will see again on some other meetups in future, because probably product management community and self-serve will make some other opportunities to meet up here. So yeah, thank you again and see you next time.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.